I want to start by saying welcome to everybody, our Vital Voices series. You know, it was funny because as I was walking Dr. Reyes up the walkway, she was asking me about this series, and she said to me, and I said, you know, we like to try to have speakers here who are interdisciplinary. And she said, well, I never intended this to be interdisciplinary. It was just the way the work happened. And I think that's just the way it happens with social work, criminal justice, and urban education, because they are truly intertwined. And I think that this is a perfect example where that wasn't the intention to go and do something interdisciplinary, but by virtue of the work, it became that. And even more so probably as you went along, in other fields as well. So Dr. Reyes, let me read here from my prepared notes. Dr. Reyes is a professor at the University of Houston College of Education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Public Policy. She formerly taught at A&M University in College Station. Dr. Reyes is a graduate of the Houston Independent School District and later served on their board while also simultaneously serving on the board of Houston Community College. Dr. Reyes received her BA in Education from Dominican College, her MA from the Harvard Graduate School, I'm from New York, from the Harvard.
Oh, no. Oh!
I didn't mean that.
Yes, you did.
No, I really did. Harvard Graduate School of Education, and her doctorate from the University of Houston in Administration and Supervision. Dr. Reyes' research focuses on urban educational leadership in environments with diverse populations. The specific areas are urban school finance, leadership preparation, behavioral policies, language issues, and race issues, examining the roles and responsibilities of principals in high poverty and one-race schools, turnaround schools, and disaster and public school policy. Someone mentioned policies, public school policy. In the spring of 16, Dr. Reyes developed a new class using her research in student discipline. The School to Prison Pipeline class is the first of its kind to be offered by the University of Houston to students in the College of Social Work. This class has allowed relationships to develop with the Harris County Juvenile Detention Center, Harris County Juvenile Detention Court, and the Harris County Juvenile Justice Alternative Education Program, JJAEP. Dr. Reyes has written over 100 referred articles, chapters, and books. She's raised over $1.2 million of federal and private funds. In the last school year, 16-17, she wrote grants totaling over $2 million in collaboration with the College of Technology. Dr. Reyes has presented at several national and international conferences. She's on the editorial boards and is a reviewer for several national professional journals. She has participated in the National Leadership Fellows Program for the Kellogg Foundation and the Houston Leadership Forum. Dr. Reyes' doctoral students can be found in leadership positions in school districts throughout the state of Texas. Dr. Reyes is married to Dr. Michael Olivas, who so willingly stepped up to the plate to serve as UHD interim president during the period preceding the arrival of Dr. Munoz. His 18-month tenure was marked with significant achievements for UHD. Thank you, Dr. Olivas. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest and colleague, Dr. Augustina Reyes.
Well, thank you all for welcoming me here. I started this journey when I was teaching at Texas A&M, and I'm teaching principals, right? So one of them comes in one day and he's so excited. He says, Dr. Reyes, you know, from now on, I don't have to put up with these kids and I can send them out of school. So there was all this excitement. And so I started looking at it, and I started looking at the data. And indeed, what fascinated me the most was that the law is called Chapter 37 of the Texas Education Code for you policy people. And it's called the Law and Order Discipline System. I wondered, why are we labeling school discipline as law and order? Because, you know, school discipline historically in the classrooms, teachers had to work with students and And that was a part of your teaching, and that was a part of the development of students. So I started looking at it, and I looked at the first case that was in right outside of Austin, Texas, and it was a student who had dropped a rock. Of course, he shouldn't have been doing that, right? But he dropped a rock and it hit a car. And so when he did that, the school district referred him to the police, and the police gave him a ticket, and the school district removed him from school and put him in a DAEP. And the parents went through the court process, and the state court, because they said he was not getting an equal educational opportunity. And so they went through, and he indeed did not have access to all his classes. He only had access to the basic classes, that basic curriculum that the state identifies as basic curriculum. And then he had a discipline class that he had to take. So the court went up to the Fifth Circuit, or to the state court, state district court. And the state district court said, well, you know, he really is being denied an equal education. So they took the case and they said the school district has to put him back in the regular classroom. But, you know, Texas, they went to the Fifth Circuit, which is where you go when you don't get what you want at the state court level. So he goes to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit said, well, you know what? This student was not removed from his school. What we did was merely transfer him, and a mere transfer is not a change, is not a removal. So the law holds, and he has to go to the DAEP. So he went to the DAEP, and I started looking. So that was the first case, and I wrote an article, at the Fordham Law Review. And a lot of my articles are not found in the education reviews. They're found in the law reviews. So if you go looking in education, you're not going to find them. But if you look at My Vita or somewhere, you will find them, because I've written several. And so I was talking with my husband one night, and I was telling him, you know what they're doing to these kids? And so together, I have to give him a little credit, we came up with criminalization of student behavior. Because now you take a school process and you make it a legal process, and you've criminalized what had in the past been part of the education process. So from there on, you know, I went on to write other education articles, and one of my articles is in the there are several that are seen as civil rights, and so they're in civil rights magazines, so the journals. So let me get started. Now I'm going to do three things. I'm going to first tell you about incarceration. This is the school to prison pipeline. So we really need to understand how incarceration works into it. The next thing I'm going to do is we're going to talk about teachers and what teachers can do, and how the research shows that there are things that teachers can do. And then the third thing, I'll share with you some of my data. So we'll go that way. And I also, at some point, want to talk about my case of 10 students. And I'll tell you a little bit about those 10 students so that you can understand also where I'm coming from. Case studies are lovely. I love to do that. And I love to get my students to do that. And I have two students who have, about three actually, who have actually done school to prison pipeline work. And all of those are in management now. And they're also teaching in higher ed. So we were doing this work when people said, that's not research. So one of the things we did was we looked at 10 kids, and we followed their discipline records for 8 years. And we took these children because they started in the 3rd grade and they passed on to the 9th grade. And so out of those 10, 8 went on to what is the DAEP. No, actually all 10 went to the Disciplinary Alternative Education Center. Only 2 never returned. 8 went on and were also sent to the JJAEP. Of those 10, 6 went on to were incarcerated by the end of school. So, and guess what they were all, what started it for all of them, why they were originally moved out of the classroom and outside of the classroom into the DAEP. What? Behavior. Yeah, behavior, but what kind of behavior?
Aggressive? Bullying?
You're warm.
Something very simple. Yeah. Fighting?
It was all fighting. All 10 of these kids in the 3rd grade, 4th grade were removed for fighting. So early on, that tells us something about what teachers can do and about what curriculum can do. So I'll be referring to some of that. There was also the reality, teachers are always pressed to teach the test. And the test is more important than behavior. And a lot of teachers don't understand. Of all these 10 kids, the parents said, the teachers understood the academics, but they did not understand the discipline, and they could do nothing for my children. So I didn't want to say that to one of my colleagues who's a national expert on discipline, but that's an issue with teachers. So classroom management and knowing what to do with children, and also children, most importantly, of other races. So that's how, to me, all of those cases say something. So there was the reality that some teachers didn't want those kids around during test period. So some of them would disappear, and of the 8, I think only 4 were ever tested. So you have all of these dynamics. So I'm gonna talk about incarceration of America, in America. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Bruce Western, but if you're if you're interested in incarceration, then you should know Bruce Western. Bruce is a sociologist at Harvard and has done most of the major work in the US on incarceration. I want to talk about teachers in schools and the data that show the disproportionality, and then I want to end with some common ground. This is Bruce's work, not mine. But if you notice, in 1940 to almost 1980, there's a pretty stable incarceration rate. And in 1980, it just shoots up to 2000. And now there's, after 2000, a slight dip. So you can just look up Bruce Western, and this is one of the charts that he's developed with additional data on incarceration. And this is like 100 per 100,000. So, and by, if you look at it, by 2013, there were 1.5 million people in state and federal prisons. 730,000 were in jail, 850,000 were on parole, and 3.9 million were on probation. In total, 6.9 million were under some kind of correctional supervision. So I think these are just interesting data, and certainly telling you what's going on in incarceration. Facts about the school to prison pipeline, incarceration, and the policy of inequality. Who's my policy person here? If you're looking for policy, It's a policy of inequality, and that's where most of the research is going to be found. According to Bruce, 70% of the black male high school student dropouts in the United States will go to prison before the age of 70. You're a high school dropout, you don't have much hope of staying out of prison. High school dropouts are 20 times more likely than college graduates to be imprisoned. 35% of the non-college blacks have been imprisoned. The prison data from and we've gone through that, so I don't think we need to go through it again. 1 of every 9 African American children has a father in prison. Children of prisoners are more likely to show symptoms of depression, aggressive behavior, and diminished school achievement. So here we have work for everybody. 2 factors increase the odds of going to prison sometime during one's life: being black, Hispanic, or poor. Those are, if you're either of those, then you have an increased possibility of going into prison. Men are 10 times more likely than women to go to prison. And you're going to find that in our school data, almost 70 to 80% of the discipline referrals are to boys. So there's all this kind of similarity. Incarceration is segregative because it removes people from their households, the labor market, and their families. So you see all these labor market reports, they never include people who have been incarcerated. So those folks are somewhere. And according to Western, the common appearance of the penal confinement in young African American man has been around since you saw where the 1990s, that data? So that was when that started. Incarceration feeds American poverty. Poverty accompanies the correlated adversity of violence, addiction, mental illness, childhood trauma, school failure, labor market discrimination, housing instability, and family complexity. And then, all of this happened during the war on drugs and the criminalization of drugs. But I was asking my students, well, how does this affect housing? And they said, well, if you've been incarcerated, they're not going to rent to you. So there are some realities up there, especially for some of you in social work, of what some of these returning individuals are running into. And of course, the labor market, they can't get jobs. Now, interesting, if you want to know about how or some recommendations for jobs for ex-offenders, you should look at Bruce Western's work. He's got a chapter on what cities can do to create jobs for people who are returning from prison. So I think I highly recommend that. Incarceration feeds American poverty. And in correlation, we've talked about the other issues. Inequality is invisible. I had one of my students, we were talking about these data, and she said, Dr. Reyes, how come I've never seen that? Well, because it segregates people. It doesn't happen in every community. It's going to happen in minority and low-income communities, and that's where it's going to be concentrated. But so on the one hand, here's one of my students who's saying, how come I've never seen that? And some of you may even be saying it, but it's overlooked as a social inequality. It's invisible. It's hard to measure, and it's concentrated in a few communities. So that's what we mean by that. How schools can help. And I'm kind of going to put some of the incarceration literature with what schools can do. And students who are suspended are more likely to be arrested than students who were never suspended. So we already know that. So when schools are suspending children, and you can find the rates are over 1 million in Texas. That what they're doing is setting up some of these children for incarceration. And Western had a student who wrote a dissertation on that. So if you look for, the student was Williams, and if you look for Williams in Western in 2013, dissertation in the Harvard Department of Sociology, you'll find that dissertation. So some of you who are interested in some cross topic issues, this is a good one to do. In 2015, he did something called From Prison to Poverty, because now you're moving from prison and into poverty. We need to be thinking about interventions that are sustained through childhood and measures that can help stabilize the home lives of at-risk kids. He's already saying, you know, if you have an at-risk kid, that kid is likely to go to prison. So he's already saying to schools and to teachers, try to do something with these kids. Focus on helping these kids. School discipline data were explored to show that the way children are treated in school helps to set them a path for later life. The data showed that students who were suspended are more likely to also go to prison. Here's some other research. There's also an issue on black girls because they make up 16% of the female population in the US, while more than 1/3 of those females arrested in schools are black girls. They start as young as the 1st grade. And Morris is this researcher who looks at what's going on with black females. And she says that because it's been such, you know, when you have 70% of the African American males who are removed are, the males who are removed are 70% African American. So she says when you have that data, all the research is focused on African American males. And so she says, consequently, we forget sometimes about black girls. Now, it's interesting because how many of you heard about the case in Massachusetts? The girls with the braids. Oh. Yeah. Okay, so it's a charter school. And there are 2 sisters who go to a charter school. And so the principal says, you have to leave because your hair is against school policy. So, you know, how many of you have gone to public schools? You know, everybody has a school policy. You go online and you hit the HISD and you'll get the HISD school policy. Same for Cy-Fair, Spring Branch, you'll get a copy of their school policies. And so the policies have these policies about hair. And they talk about braids and extensions, and is that ethnocentered, you think? So they take, and these 2 girls, their mother works with them and goes to the Attorney General in Boston or in Massachusetts, and the Attorney General investigates. And so she looks at the policies, and she looks at the interpretations, and she looks at what's going on in the school. And she says, first of all, you had girls with green hair who were never removed. And then remember, the policy is a hair policy. They also have, by the way, a fingernail policy. So she said, you can't do that because this is discriminatory. And so she forced the school district or that school to have the girls return to class. Now, what's interesting about that is if you want to do a comparison, and one of my students is doing that, which is just really great. So what you do is you take that Boston policy, student handbook policy. I went and I looked up that handbook because I knew there had to be a comparison. So I looked at that, and then I looked at some of the Houston area schools and their policies. And guess what? We have the same thing. Yeah, so I looked at those things, and I think, those things really need to change. And in a while, I'm going to show you that most of the discipline referrals in Texas come about as a result of the local district policies and not the state law. And I'll show you some differences there. So Nance is also a researcher who shows how forms of punishment such as suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and school-based arrests are used to discipline students for violations of school rules. And clearly, and I put it here, chapter 37 of the Texas Education Code, .015 says that school districts have to collaborate or coordinate with law enforcement offices. And as you know, a lot of the districts have contracts with various law enforcement entities in Harris County. So, and some of you may work in some of those contracted areas. So what happens is that even if a principal thinks that a student is involved in some illegal activity, that principal has to call law enforcement and tell them that he thinks that student X is involved. So this is also, and it's for principal of a public and private elementary or secondary. This is also how immigrant kids get referred to immigration, because the principal thinks this kid has broken a law, so he calls law enforcement can call ICE can come to the student's home. And that is, and I even give you a citation for that if you want to read that, because we've been doing also some work on immigrant students. And immigrant students, if they break a rule, if they get a ticket, if they break the law, then the principal's going to call law enforcement, and law enforcement is going to call ICE. So that's your connection on that one. How teachers can help. There's a great study from Stanford. If teachers convey respect while disciplining students, this may improve student behavior. This is a study that was done on teachers and student discipline. And they found that by training teachers, it's an online program. It's not even face-to-face. So so they did that, and they trained teachers online, and the discipline referrals went down from 9% to 4%. So this is a great study to look at, and also, a program to consider for training teachers. But also what they do here is that they really focus on teachers having empathy and relationships with students. You're going to find that the relationship component is really strong with kids who are in the school to prison pipeline. And a lot of the research shows that. Another thing that's really strong is there have been several studies on the effects of Black teachers on student discipline. And this is they've been doing it, and they published it, I think, really last year in Education X. And that's a very conservative journal. But so what they did was they analyzed disciplinary and demographic data for 50,000 North Carolina teachers and 1 million students. And what they found was that Black teachers with Black students had lower discipline referrals. So that was one study. And here's another study that just came out, and I think it's Johns Hopkins, that just one Black teacher between the 3rd and the 5th grade can improve. Black students are more likely to graduate, and it gives some of the numbers. So that's another really interesting study. Now, what's the issue with black teachers?
They can relate to them better.
Pardon me?
They can relate to them better.
Right. What's the national policy issue? My policy people. Policy issue is that 78 to 80% of all the teachers in the U.S. are white. So we have, it's a supply problem. Clearly there's a demand, right? Because what? Almost 50% of the children in the U.S. are children of color. So there is that's the policy issue nationally, is that we just don't have enough teachers. So some of the things, some of the old research on culturally relevant, and a lot of you, I mean, you just said, you said that, that what?
The teachers can relate to the students better.
Yeah, yeah, teachers understand these kids better and can work with them better. I had one of my principals who's in largely African-American school, and she was African-American too. And so this kid comes in one morning and says to the teacher, he comes in, drops and falls asleep, and the teacher keeps trying to wake him up, and the kid finally says, he says, if you don't leave me alone, I'm gonna kill you. So, you know, when you say the kill word, what do? Call the police.
Get 'em in.
This woman was not, did not respond that way. She said, I knew that student, and I knew that if something was going on, that he would not behave this way unless something was going on. So she brings him in, and she says, Johnny, what's going on? I mean, why'd you say that to your teacher? And the kid said, last night I didn't sleep all night. My mother's boyfriend had a gun on her head, and then he had it on my head. And then that kid got up in the morning and went to school, because school is a safe haven for a lot of these kids. And we ought to be glad that they're showing up. So she took him and gave him kind of the day off, did not send him to the police. But clearly that child needed counseling, some kind of services to help him get through that kind of trauma. The trauma that kids go through and the services that are available to them are very little. Out of my 10 cases, one student, out of the 10, none of them, first of all, were in special education in K through 5. In the 6th grade, middle school, 8 of them went into special education. One of them in elementary school was schizophrenic. The teachers knew that he would just take off, and the parent would come in and say, I don't know what's wrong with him. You know, he just goes off, and I have to wait until the police bring him home or someone brings him home. And indeed, that child was deeply ill, and he did get some services from mental health services, but the school did not even put him in a special ed class. So, you know, how do you identify these kids, and how do you provide the services that they need? And you'll see what some teachers have said about that. Building teacher capacity. This is another study, and teachers and school administrators can affect a child's trajectory into and through the pipeline to prison in at least 4 ways. Once again, supportive relationships with students, like that principal took him and took her student and said, what's going on with you? Didn't jump the gun and didn't throw him into a police station or into a DAEP. Through their attitudes and social emotional competence. And I'm going to do a little on social emotional by contributing to conditions for learning and through their responses to student behavior. So I thought this was an interesting piece on social emotional learning and a multidimensional approach, understanding the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of students. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes may not be the best strategy to use. And this professor said, I'm very different and may project my background and my personal history into the student situation. And that's, you know, the cross-cultural thing, is that you may project your expectations on that child. And this, by the way, is a Harvard professor who's doing research on social emotional. So this may not be the best strategy to use. And you may need to understand how to do that differently. And I thought that was just really so powerful for him to say, putting yourself in someone else's shoes may be a bad strategy. So that's why you need to know more about the background of the children that you're working with. And the families too. Student sense of belonging, being judged negatively because of their race, disability, and gender. Education Week did a survey within the last year on the school's sense of belonging is important. It starts with teachers. And teachers reported, you know, I'm fitting in because they are academically struggling in challenging student attitudes, lack of confidence, and special education needs. They say these are the needs that I work with and that I don't have time to tend to. You know, it's bad and it's busy enough for me to do children who are academically challenged. I don't have enough time to also work with the kids who have an attitude about their self-confidence. So these are things that, and special education needs, like clearly in my sample of the elementary kids, no one took time to really do evaluations of these children until they got to middle school. So these are all issues that teachers say that they would like to, but they don't have the time. Teachers need to teach to the test, lack of resources, time. They say, well, you know, not only I've got to make sure that the test is the highest priority here, that that we're getting through and we're having good test scores. So even now, that's a priority. So I don't have time to do the other. So there are those kinds, and not only do I not have time, I don't have the resources. Resources are what? Money. And a number of these schools don't have the resources for an extra counselor, or more than an extra, to counsel kids, to work through some of the traumas and to refer them. And we also did a study with one of the schools of one of my students, and we looked at all of these social service agencies, because you know there are a number of them out there. And what we basically found was that not a whole lot of them were actually doing things for their school, or actually in there helping to change things for students. So you have that issue of, I guess, some selectivity on what the agencies do in the communities. So that was an issue with one school. Then also some student concerns. Some students, you know, not only do they lack of sense of belonging or the need for a sense of belonging, that a sense of belonging is important, they often get that idea because there are lack of diverse reading materials, mostly white female teaching staff, lack of support from administrators and colleagues, even some of these teachers who would like to do something, sometimes the administrators are not as supportive. So there's an issue there. Let's see. So I did social emotional because I think that if I had 10 kids who got removed from the classroom because they were fighting, that I need to try to do more about social emotional development, and that needs to be more of the curriculum in the school. So now there's a lot of research on social emotional. I've provided 3 for you here. These are really, I think, really good references. This one too, this one is particularly good. Jones, this is a group of Harvard professors who did an evaluation of student social emotional learning from the inside out. So I think you'll get a lot of good information. It was also funded by the Wallace Foundation. So I think, and it's pretty current. And then for those of you, how many of you are familiar with the future of children? You're a social worker? Anyway, you need to really, this future of children is just this great reference for research. It's from Princeton Brookings Institute, and in the spring of 2017 they came out with the entire issue was on social emotional learning, and I think that in the fall they also came out with a second issue on social emotional, because when I did my analysis of my 10 students, I thought, what's going to be best for these kids? How do we try to help? And it isn't just students who need help, it's parents. And so, yeah. And so one of the things that this journal did was there was an article in there on doing parent kind of on-site work site development in the schools with the students, so that you do both of them. So I think with some kids, you can do just the kids. I know that, and I also referred you to HISD, because HISD talks about what they're doing in their social emotional learning program. But you know, there's so many objections because it's feely touchy, right? Supposedly. So some of these kids are actually learning about social emotional. And so they're going home and they're teaching the parents, like, you know, when one of the consultants was telling me about a parent came in and was getting real hyper. And the kid said, "Mom, bring it down a level." So the kid was teaching the parents. So, and I don't know, it's a good program, and when I see 8 kids or 10 kids out of 10 who are referred into the DAEP for fighting, I think that we need some social emotional training. Let me tell you now numbers. So we're going to start with this one, and this is like for the state of Texas, there are 5.5 million students in the entire state. Those break down to 12% African American, 50% Hispanic, 30% white, and the others Asian, Indian, and another mixed race. So those are our data for how these 5 million kids break out. And 500,000 are reported were reported in 2016, 2017. These data are so easy to get. There's this whole section, you go to the Texas Education Agency and you go to discipline products. And then you just play around with that. You know, after a while you find 10 sites. I have one that I do for DAEPs, and it's an annual report that TEA does for the legislature. It's the only section that looks at students in DAEP using male, female, how many days, race, and so forth in there. So it's great. There are great data in there. So this is how many there are in, and 500,000 is students, because there are 2 kinds of counts. One count is students, and the other count is numbers of times. So there's 16,000 offenses. So some of these kids are going to go in there once, and some are going to go 2 or 3 times or 4 times, whatever. And these are, if you look, we had what, 1 point what? We had 1.6 in the host state, discipline record count. But the discipline record count just from that, remember that student code of behavior? 1.2 million counts just from that. So you should go to your board meetings, especially when they're going to vote on passing a student code of conduct. So you can see the majority of the discipline referrals are coming from districts, and the way districts define what a behavior problem is and how that's enforced by individuals. Now, so here are the real crimes that we're supposed to be about. Teachers have the right to remove a student. And so there are 500 of those. And then you get all of these punishable as a felony because, kids can get tickets. Even though in 2013, the law changed because from 1995 to 2013, a kid could be given a ticket that he had to go to court for and created his record for a number of reasons. In 2013, one of the state representatives who does juvenile justice said we need to stop giving kids tickets. So for the most part, they've stopped giving them. There are still, as you can see, a few of those. Controlled substance, that's the highest offense in this category. 22,000. I don't know what controlled substance is. Marijuana?
Cigarettes. Don't they count cigarettes in that?
I do. Yes, you're right. They do, because I had a principal who told me if they're smoking a cigarette, I just look the other way. Now, you don't want them to look the other way. The best thing would be just not to put it on there. And so, and alcohol violations, 2,000. Volatile chemicals, I don't know, could that be glue? Maybe. There were only 37 in the state of Texas. Pardon? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the paint and stuff, yeah. So Title V felonies, there are so many felonies in school policy that it's no wonder that you have to have the center at TSU to expunge records. So these illegal knife, 305, and I don't have guns, but guns is a major one also. Oh, it is? How many? 104. Yeah, that's not, they must not be searching everyone. All I can think of. So let me look, we're going to look at the discipline policy, and remember those awful cases. Now, there are also a number of other counts, but I'd have you here until midnight listening to those. So, but the other counts include murder, and murder in Texas schools generally is not reported because they are under 5 in the entire state. So they may be 0, but they're not 100 like you expected when this law enforcement policy came to be. So they aren't reported, and they're less than 5. Look for yourself. But so those are like mandatory crimes. This law was created because there were kids who were drinking, smoking marijuana, whatever, and carrying guns and knives and all these other things. So those were mandatory removals. Mandatory means you have to remove the students. So if you look, the Texas population in each year, the disciplined population is about 15% of the state, and it's gone down. It actually went down between 2013 and 2015, and I would say that a lot of that had to do with the change in law for no more ticketing. And so you see, and I'm going to show you in a minute, this slope that goes down. And if you look, you're only supposed to put students in the mandatory removal. So you find that the DAEP, which is right here, the DAEP only removes less than 50% of the students are for mandatory removals every year. And the JJAEP is next to prison, and they also are less than 50%. What happens is that there is a thing called discretionary. And so a teacher comes in and you know what, Johnny? 5 days in a row you came in without your homework. And the rules for the district policy says that after 3, I can get rid of you. I can send you to the DAEP for not bringing in homework, for not doing other kinds of things. And so I'm going to send you out. And that's where that 50% comes from, is that area of teacher discretion. And you'll find, I mean, you know, where some teachers say, oh God, Johnny is so bad. I just look forward to the day when he's not here, when he's absent or something. But this gives them the out to remove students, because you know what, they don't have resources to provide additional tutoring. And a lot of these, I think, are you'll see, they're academic issues. So I'm just gonna, theory of disproportionality. This is just the ratio of the percentage of students by race of Black, Hispanic, and Indians experiencing discipline removals compared to the percentage of students of the same race or ethnic groups in the majority using some kind of statistical analysis. Skiba, who has a chapter in my book, is really the person who started this work. Skiba is a psychologist, for those of you interested in psychology. He went to the American Psychological Association and said, we must write a statement about how we should not use zero tolerance as a way to disciplining students. So the American Psychological Association has this stance about not using zero tolerance. So these are all, African American families are 2.19% in the elementary, 3.78 in the middle school, times as likely to be referred to the principal's office for behavior than our white peers. And you go through and you see all the removals are pretty much like that. So I'm just gonna leave this. And here's the DAEP by race. So here you see now African Americans, just the DAEP, not all the referrals, but just the DAEP, they make up, They make up 17 to 18% of the removals, even though they only make up 12% of the population. In some states, it's even worse. Latinos make up 50%, and they make up to 60% of the removals. And these others are very small. White make up 30%, and 20 to 19%, basically an average of 20% of the removals. And so you see the disproportionality. In every case, it's like that. Okay, so here are same data. Economically disadvantaged. Remember what Western said, you gotta be Black, Hispanic, or poor. So the DAEP students who were economically disadvantaged were 70 to 80% economically disadvantaged, almost exactly the way he called it. And JJAEP, the same thing. So what you have here is children who are poor and children who are of color. Special education, you see Texas had 10% almost and 9%. And there was a scandal in Texas because they were not properly identifying a special education student because they capped them at 10%. So if you look here in the DAEP, they made up 19% to 17%, probably an average of 19. JJAEP from 21 to 19 to 18. So special ed kids were over-identified for removal from school. Let's see, what do we got? Percentages by race. Increases of African American females. We kind of talked a little bit about that. And I've given you some additional sites. I also will have a chapter in my book on that. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book. So one of the things that we as academics have to do is that we have to get the most points for us for promotion. And well, I don't need promotion, but every year you're reviewed. And so my goal is to put out the book, but to first take the articles and publish them independently so that I get double bonus. And if you, yeah, you know, your pay depends on it. So, and everyone, I don't know, how many of you use Google Scholar? Okay, as a favor to me, go online and read one of my articles from Google Scholar, because that also gives me points. The more people that read my articles on Google Scholar, the more my points go up. So I think, you know, if you work at an institution and that's what they require, that's what you do. So, and we look here also at male and female. One of the things that I think I have in my chapter some African American females and males. I think I have some by race, but they're really hard data to get. But you can get them, you just have to go through there and analyze them. So, but basically in the state of Texas, about 49 to 50% of the students are female and 53 to 51. Generally, there are more males than females. So, DAEPs, if you look, the females are 26 to 27. And you see how they're increasing. In 2015, they went up to 27. The males are always at 74 to 70. So that is high. Let's see, mandatory students, JJAEP, and here's some other data on male and female. The odds of going to prison, 2 factors increase the odds of going to prison, being Black, Hispanic, and being poor. Okay, at-risk students. If schools are to help students, they should focus on the needs of at-risk students. Here is someone who studies prisons and incarceration, and he's telling educators, and he's starting to get into education because his students are starting to study that. And he says, if you want to do something, focus on that at-risk student. In-school suspensions. I like in-school suspensions because if you're going to punish a kid, punish him at home. Don't send him out. What happens when you send a kid out?
They're not learning.
Not learning? What else?
Exposure to
They're friends. They've got friends, socialization. You know, that's why they go to school, to socialize. So you separate them from their friends. You take them away from their teachers. You do, and you education people all know that. When you do that, that's why attendance is so important too. When you do all those things, students are going to learn less. So if you look at these in school, so even though they're in school and low income also, 66 to 73%. In school, at risk, 60 to 67%. Special ed, 15 to 14%. So the same categories keep showing up in different areas. And there is, if you look at those lines, there is a decrease, or there has been a decrease in Texas in the last 5 years. And probably because in 2013 they changed the law on ticketing children. School discipline data was explored to show that the way children are treated in school helps them on a path for later life. So that the data showed that students who were suspended were more likely to be arrested versus students who were never suspended. Okay, here's some out of school suspensions, also the same thing, low income, at risk, and special education. Only if you look at out of school, they're higher in those categories, and they're also going to be higher in the race categories. Expulsion, that's really bad too, and low income, at risk, special education. In search of a common ground, where are we today? As you know, that this thing happened, there was a decline, but it was during the Obama administration. It was during the Obama Office of Civil Rights work. And we now see that DeVos may rescind something they call the 2014 policy people, DOE and DOJ Dear Colleague letters. They're these letters that go out to all the superintendents in the country, and they're called the Dear Colleagues. They come from the Commissioner of Education in Texas, and they come from the Department of Education in the US. Federal policy, right? So this was a federal policy Dear Colleague letter that said, addressing disparities by race and special education in public schools. And so people are willing to admit that there is a need to recognize that disproportionality possibly exists because of biases, implicit or otherwise, discrimination, and systemic racism. There's a need to recognize schools responding badly to the 2014 mandates in schools. There's also a fear that because if you do what the 2014 memo said, that schools may become unsafe and disorderly. And the teachers and students deserve an environment that's conducive to learning, and no one disputes that. Suspensions and expulsions should be as rare as possible. Schools should be as safe as possible. What schools can do: create a culture where students feel safe, respected, and engaged. Everyone is held to high expectations in terms of work and behavior. Creating engaging learning environments. Problems: sometimes there's a weak culture in a school, regardless of where that school is. People need to become more active. And look at your discipline referrals. Look at these data for that school. If they're too high, something is wrong. So it may be in a low-income community, but there's something wrong if those children are only being deported out of school. And unless low-income parents become more involved, it'll continue. So the weak culture, weak leadership, low expectation, poor plan for student success, poorly organized, dysfunctional environments, and most of all, resources. And as you know, in Texas, we've had school resources cut, and everyone taking credit for doing this great job of cutting the budget on the backs of children. And finance is up again in the legislature this year, so we need to really look closely at that. Troublemakers, and I'm going to leave you with this. When students act out, why do we seek out flaws in their character? Shouldn't we instead search for the flaws in our schools and our teaching, holding us, the adults, primarily responsible? Shouldn't we find better ways to understand the problem children, the ways we label troublemakers? And this is a teacher who wrote this book, and it's called Troublemakers. Go out and get it if you're a teacher. And she talks about, her issues. I didn't, pretty much looking forward to this 29 big-eyed 11th and 12th graders slurping coffee and ice. So this is the book, Troublemakers. Yeah, so I leave you with that. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Of the number of schools that get referred to the DAEPs, are they still counted in the funding calculations for school findings?
Can you
It's
repeat the question because we're recording?
Okay.
Do you want to take the microphone?
The question is a funding question, and it's a good question, because first of all, let me tell you where the funding for the DAEP comes. There's this pot of money for at-risk kids, so they take it all and they fund the DAEP and JJAEP. So that's where, so you're taking from the kids who really need it in schools, and you're putting it in these external environments. So you have that, and are they counted? Yes. And it depends when you remove them. They have this October count, and once they do the October count, they count them. The big issue has been testing. Who gets their test scores, because you get them out of the room, out of the school, and you don't have to add them up with your campus. I think that they are now requiring that the DAEP score of a student go back to the campus, so it's counted there. However, as in my case, out of the 10, only 4 were tested. So 10 just fell through the cracks. Another question? Yes, sir.
Professor, if you don't mind. Something you brought up that I thought was really interesting, and I was curious about. Something that you brought up that I was really curious about is you were talking about principals calling the law, and in turn the law enforcement officers calling ICE. I was curious if you felt that that was because of their policy within the school, or you felt like that was just the culture at that school system.
I think it's both. And I think, these principals are trained by their districts and are told, these are your responsibilities. They didn't call ICE. They called the police, law enforcement. There's nothing that says that you have to coordinate with ICE. They say you have to coordinate with law enforcement. And it's law enforcement who calls ICE. And there are cases, and I gave you a citation for that.
No, I understand what you're saying, Professor. Now, my quick question for you is on that. Is the law enforcement side required to inform ICE because they receive certain funding and policies from their department, and they have to follow that in order to get federal funding? So is that, I guess that kind of...
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I don't know what the policy is in law enforcement. I don't know if there's a policy. I mean, and generally what the policy comes from chief of police, the mayor, and that culture.
Okay.
So and that's just a political answer, because that appears to be the reality, that if the mayor and the police, the mayor sets the tone, city council sets the tone, and it goes down to the police. Good question, so I never would have thought of that one.
My question is more towards the training for educators, the teachers that are actually in the classroom. Do you feel like that when educating the teachers that they need special training in order to kind of see the difficulties that the kids are having, if there's psychological difficulties, if there are things that are going on at home.
Absolutely.
They need to connect with social services and things like that. Because kids can have psychological issues. And I don't know what the segregation to being a special education child from the general population, how that affects the child and their ability to learn.
But you can see how kids need a lot of attention from teachers, relationships. Bring your mom in. I think this woman in this book would go with the worst kids to their baseball game, to their community stuff, visit with the parents, and do things between the family and the school. I mean, that's the real connection, is what am I doing with the families? I mean, that's, if we've got to affect families first. And teachers have to be brave enough to say, okay, Johnny, I'm going home with you today. But, you know, like my 10 kids, they had a lot of really hard issues to deal with. So as a teacher, you need to know that, and you need to go home and face it with the student. Okay.
Did you do any comparison, or do you know of anyone who's done comparison studies between the effects of the in-school suspension and the out-of-school? Because I know in the middle school where I worked, we had in-school suspension, and what we did is each teacher who was like head of a content area, we were required to spend our 1 period a day in there teaching the students that particular area. So like if I'm the reading teacher, I work with them on their reading.
Number
It
one,
seemed to help.
why should you be punished during your off time when what you need is resources to do that? Yes, I think that's a good thing, but it comes off your back. And that's what we mean, and that's why teachers say, I'd like to do that, but I don't have the resources. I don't have the time. And that's a real issue that needs to be dealt with. I don't know, comp time is illegal. So it's not like, okay, Mrs. Jones, you spent 5 hours, you spent 10 hours, so I'm gonna give you a day off. Maybe it could be more flexible, but those are issues. But yeah, that would be perfect. So, and that's the reason that in school is better than out of school, because you maintain a contact with your teacher and your peers. I mean, you walk to them in school, and you see them in the hallway.
Anyone else?
Yeah, before my husband says, yes, can I go home?
We've got her now.
I'm here for Walmart. Don't you think there should be some kind of policy, a group of people within a school system that when these kids have a problem, that they look into it and see why these kids have a problem? Because most of the time, the teachers don't have the time.
Exactly. So I don't know how you create those groups, but I think an innovative principal would find a way.
But I mean, at the school itself, I mean, you probably don't even have enough people.
Yeah,
And-
yeah.
And lots of times they have found out through research that a lot of these kids are coming to school hungry. That's why most of the problems arise from.
Yeah, and a lot of family issues. You know, my class is made up of students from the School of Social Work and Leadership program. So it's kind of a cross section, and I'm really glad to see one of my students is doing a study on what teachers can do and how she can affect her district on what teachers can do in discipline referrals. And the other one is, and I'm not going to give the names of the institution, but she's working with on a reentry program with a local university and a local major, I guess, not a foundation, but a major, I can't tell you the name, community center. So, but see, so they take what I give them and they go out and they're doing things in the community. And things that they would not have thought of doing. Plus, I just give them all the research.
While we have you, so this whole thing about, in the South in particular, it's different in the West and East Coast, there's a culture of having social workers in the schools. And we do not have that here. And it's something that we're always sort of bumping up against. We take small steps in the area, and we're really pushing hard with our students, our social work program, to get them into schools. And certain school districts are better than others, or principals have a lot of local control of their schools. And so it's something we would love, in the future, if you see this as a partnership, or how we can collaborate with you, or just be a resource. Or
Now, is communities in school taking up that role?
well, yes and no. Communities in schools they don't have to be social workers, but you see social workers in those decisions. But they're not hard money funded. It's dependent upon the principal if you want. The principals are interested, and I think that's the way in, especially in this area. So community schools are great. It's dropout prevention. You can have them at every level. It's a wonderful program. It's just I think there's to be some upfront money. You have to put money up front in your school, and then the process comes along. The board has to approve it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it takes the place of a real professional social worker or social work staff in.
Yeah, and I've had my students say, I'm going to make more money at this center instead of going as a social worker to the school. And do we see new social workers in school districts? Not in HISD. I mean, their budget is, yeah.
Oh, we got football budget.
Yeah.
We got football budget though.
And I don't really have a question, but I think that's part of the issue, growing up in a poverty neighborhood, going to a low-income school. I've experienced all of these things firsthand that you speak about. One of the major issues is that we don't have enough education providers. There's not enough institutions where we can properly house the children to give them the proper education. Even if it's not an education that is extenuous to a certain extent, there's not enough professors, teachers, or educators around to give classrooms the proper quality. Example, I have a kid, he is right now in a semi-private institution because of the smaller classes. We were first in a public institution with approximately 30 kids, and he will come and he's like, I'm not learning anything. I'm not learning anything because the teachers are focused on discipline, they're focused on the test, they're focused on things that do not teach me outside of test zone. If it's not about test zone, then it's not important. Yeah, and it's not important if it's not, and that is one of the major issues. And the fact that there's not enough social workers, there's not someone who, my dad had a gun to my head and I can go and talk to you in confidence to let you know this is going on. Because and it might just be a black thing, but we're so caught up in the stigma of being separated from our homes that we don't want to come and give you the issues to help us with what's going on.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So I kind of think the prison, the pipeline thing, it's amazing that what you're thinking. I think it needs to go down to a third grade basic level. So
Oh, absolutely.
It starts in elementary school where the kids are being labeled and kids are being not and kids are being told you are a bad person because I only take in what you teach me. If you tell me that if you tell me
that's exactly what the literature says.
Exactly.
You learn what you're
exposed to.
What you're exposed to.
Everything is a learned nature.
So I would be in your school just raising steam.
I think I caused enough.
Yes, I just want to bring out two things. I remember that gentleman you talked about the ICE a while ago. I'm a youth advocate for Brazos County, right by Texas A&M University, and we received federal funding, federal grants. So we are actually obliged to report.
Oh my!
And we have to call Homeland Security. That's under the new protocol.
So it's a funding policy that comes from the funding agent, and the funding agent is,
Of course, the new administration,
what's the name of it? It's
I cannot say,
immigration naturalization?
I cannot say.
Yeah,
Yes. I signed up papers. saying-
yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
And the second one, do you think our educational system is flawed, and why is that the government, not paying attention to it?
I think that, minorities are,
Everybody knows that. We've got-
minority parents and low-income parents are so overwhelmed that they don't have time
Do
to
we
be,
have to have that gap, though? Why do we love that gap? Why do we have to have that 1%? Why do we have to? I'm not being socialist, but it's just.
yeah,
It doesn't make sense.
I think that you just need to be very active in the formal organizations of your school. You need to be seen. I had a parent, I work with low-income parents, and this woman couldn't read. She spoke only Spanish, and she was at the school every day. I said, why do you go there? She was a volunteer. She said, because if they see my face, they're going to treat my children better.
Yeah.
So even in whatever school you're in, if they see your face, they're going to treat your children better. Okay, so thank you very much.
We'd like to give you a little something. Hold on one second.
Sophia, you need to meet Michael. Oh, how nice. Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful frame. Thank you.
And that will, a copy of that will remain in our hallway forever.
Oh,
So-
good. Thank you.
This is exactly the kind of, this is the reason why we do this series.
Yeah.
Because you all get so involved. It's an interdisciplinary issue that affects everybody. Everybody at every level. And we thank you so
Yeah.
very much for bringing all
Thank
this.
you. Thank you.